So hi everyone, my name is Veronica Jane Bertiz, as my friends have mentioned. Is it loud enough? Okay. So for our workshop, we just want to highlight the objectives that we want to put forward, which is going to be understanding the intricacies of anti-Asian racism and how policing affects our communities as member of the Filipinx communities, and what would be the better alternatives to policing for our Filipinx communities. So I would like to start with racism and oppression and its colonial rule. So I broke it down to three parts of racism, which is systemic, structural, and then institutional. So the way I see it, in a settler colonial state like Canada, the systems that were put in place at the creation of the country benefited the white colonists, while it disadvantaged indigenous populations who have lived here for thousands of years prior to colonialism. Taking land away from indigenous peoples across all of the Americas and then bringing in free labor from Africa and enslaving black people created wealth and opportunities for white people. For example, Canada's federal policing system, the RCMP, was created in order to control the indigenous populations in post-Confederation Canada. The RCMP have continued to be perpetrators of violence against black and indigenous people for over 150 years later. So I think of it more of like a tree. The root is racist. Everything that grows from it is within the racist ideologies who oppressed and alienated people who are considered the othered. And then the term for systemic racism, and then it interchanged with structural racism, it refers to a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial inequity. It identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness. And it disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt over time. So structural racism is not something that a few people or institutions choose to practice. Instead, it has been a feature of the social, economic, and political system that we're all living in. Structural racism refers to the interdependence of one institution to next. For example, when black kids are disproportionately put into special education classes, become disruptive out of boredom, are expelled from school, and then they are criminalized as adults. So once you get into that space of being in prison, it locks you into a trajectory in life of competing for resources. Once you have the mark of criminal, it invades every aspect of your life and you can't get an apartment for a job. So this, I see it more of like the branches of the trees, where racist values sprout through policies, laws, which are, by the way, created by lawmakers who claim to represent me. Then lastly, for racial discrimination that derives from individuals carrying out and dictates of who others are, they are prejudiced for this society. The institutional racism is a form of racism that is embedded as a normal practice within the society or an organization. It can lead to such issues as discrimination in criminal justices, employment, housing, healthcare, political power, education, among other issues. Institutional racism involves policies and practices in the procedures of institutions that have disproportionately negative effect on racial minorities. So the access and the quality of goods, the services, the opportunities, it's inaccessible for us. Systemic racism is the basis of individual and institutional racism. It is the value that is embedded in a society that supports and allows discrimination. To understand institutional racism, it is important to understand the interaction between prejudice and the discrimination. So from a perspective of a tree, it's the flowers and the fruits. These laws, these policies that are enforced, they are enforced by the law enforcers, aka the police. And they are institutional staff members who bring in this prejudice, stereotype ideas that further alienates and othered us. So the lasting effects of the colonial rule for us as members of the Filipinx community, and of course we want to tackle the divide and conquer, and then the us and them mentality, and then even the colonial mentality of crabs in the bucket. Yeah, sure.
So I don't think we actually introduced ourselves more in depth, which was so funny. We were like so excited to get this started, right? And to share like all this information with you. But my name is Fran Stoner. I am a mental health counselor and a community organizer. In my day-to-day, I work at Vanier College in student mental health and wellness. And then outside of that, I try to serve the Filipino community as best as possible, which is why we founded Sant Kapwa, to really fill a representation gap, because while Filipinos have been here for a long time, there has been no organization focused solely on the youth and the youth's needs. So that's what we're trying to bring today. And maybe you can tell from Veronica's beginning of presentation, she is a community member that we're very proud of. She just completed her paralegal studies, so she's really coming from that lens of how we can do better by migration, globalization, and all that for our people. So yes, moving forward, another lasting effect of colonial rule for us has been the internalized colonialism, right? The internalized racism. So colonial mentality. We have this saying in our culture where we are like, oh, Filipinos don't really like other Filipinos. They struggle with crabs in a bucket mentality. So it's like this analogy that if you put a whole bunch of crabs in a bucket, one tries to climb out, the other one's going to pull him down. But if we look at that from a more decolonial lens, the bucket is the system, right? The bucket is colonialism. Crabs don't belong in a bucket. They belong at the beach. They belong in beautiful environments, right? So how might we work together to destroy the bucket? Some recent proof that this is really present in the Filipino psyche is that there is this collective kind of Stockholm syndrome. We have just re-elected the son of a dictator who is actually so during the time of Marcos was the time of martial law, and for most Filipinos that you encounter in the diaspora, the reason we are here was because of the previous Marcos dynasty. But somehow, because of poverty, because of lack of education in the country, his son was elected into office. So it's kind of like similar to like why Trump was elected and all that, of like poor folks associating money with goodness, right? So because there's like that lack of education there. So to talk more specifics when it comes to Filipinos, when it comes to Asians, there are three really important points when we're talking about anti-Asian racism. So the 3 points are the model minority myth, yellow peril, and the stereotype of the perpetual foreigner. So for the model minority myth, it's the cultural expectation placed on Asians as a group that each individuals will be smart. Like stereotypes we've heard is like naturally good at math, science, and technology, things like that. Definitely not me. Wealthy, movies like Crazy Rich Asians, while cool representation, but what kind of representation are we getting? It really disadvantages the Asians who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and then kind of these like weird standards are set. Hardworking, self-reliant, like living the American dream kind of thing, docile and submissive, obedient and uncomplaining, and or spiritually enlightened, so never in need of assistance, right? When we look at spirituality from a decolonial lens, there is an inner personal piece to work on that cannot be done without the outer community piece to work on. So another myth, right? Let's debunk all these myths. So the stereotype pits Asians against other BIPOC community because it really perpetuates the false notion that like we're the good Asians and then the other immigrants are not. Yes, so for our next point, and I'm sure that a lot of other immigrants will feel this and how it manifests in their culture, but the perpetual foreigner stereotype. So it's the false belief that no matter where you were born or where you were raised, whatever history, as a visible minority, you will never be fully Canadian. It reinforces the problematic idea that Canadian is a white person of European ancestry, and it also assumes that anyone that doesn't fit this image is by default non-Canadian, a foreigner. Not only does this completely ignore the history and presence of Canada's Indigenous people, but it judges someone's right to belong based on their looks rather than where they were born or their participation or contribution to the society. And the last point that I wanted to bring forward with regards to anti-Asian racism, and more specifically due to the pandemic, is this notion of yellow peril. So yellow peril is this racist metaphor that represents Asian people as a threat to Western civilizations. And it's basically like seen as as a means of like fear mongering, right? So, and this is like nothing new. I'm just trying to find my notes. So many papers. We're too used to technology and computers, and it's all there, right? So yellow peril first became a source of social tension when the Chinese arrived in North America during the gold rush of the 1850s. And these racist stereotypes further spread in Canada when Chinese laborers arrived to build the Canadian Pacific Railway. So seen as an Asian invasion, this migration stoked unfounded fears of Asians as job stealers, as being immoral, and as being filthy threats to Canadian society. Once the railway was completed, yellow peril sentiment led to the Chinese head tax, where Chinese were charged as much as $500, the equivalent of 2 years' salary at the time, as a way to discourage their immigration. By 1923, nearly all Chinese immigration to Canada was banned under the Chinese Exclusion Act. We also all know about, Japanese internment camps. I mean, I think we can name a whole bunch of stuff in our history to just kind of demonstrate that, like, this is nothing new.
So that's just the policies that I just mentioned and how it's still kind of, it blooms and the fruits of it, we're still living on it. The statistics, just to like remind people, when we entered COVID 2020, the statistics of Asian hate crimes jumped from 318%. That's for South Asian. And then 121% for increase for Southeast Asian. So that, want to take a moment to just set that tone that 318% of hate, just because you're coming from a specific area of the world. So I want to point out what is being Asian, and in this case for us being members of the Filipinx community. I would like to point out that we're not a monolith. We're like one of the biggest number of population in this world. And we have our own set of beliefs, culture, heritage, language. We actually have like at least 200 languages in the islands of the Philippines alone. There's 7,000 islands in there. So there's like 110 million Filipinos just in the island itself, and that's 110 million of culture, heritage, languages. We are survivors of 330 years of Spanish Empire, so that's why we have like Spanish names and some of our words sounds like Spanish. And we are also under U.S. capitalist system, and being a former colony of the USA, we're using their own system. When we go vote to the Congress, we go yay or nay. We don't speak English, but we're voting for policies and we go say yay or nay. So that just goes to show that it's the system that we supposedly inherit because we're supposed to be barbaric and we don't know how to run things. So we're using it to this day. We are the third largest immigrant community here in Canada, actually here in North America. We're the #1 supplier of healthcare workers. So, you get injured here. I know it's a stereotype that we play, but I got injured here. I didn't have my carte de soleil yet. My neighbor was Filipina, so she just stitched me up. So I didn't need to go to the hospital for that one. So I would like to use this as our power that like we are healthcare workers and we just want to provide care for everyone else. And I want to highlight that they're not receiving the attention that they deserve, aka also money. They haven't been being paid properly. And we're #1 supplier of cheap labor because 110 million of Filipinos just in the island alone.
I just wanted to add a quick little note on deprofessionalization because, again, our university system was brought in by the Americans. And just imagine for a second if a student from Harvard would come to Canada and be like, hey, can I get my transcripts and my equivalencies? I'm pretty sure most universities here in Montreal would be like, sure, Harvard, no problem, right? But if someone were to come from the University of Santo Tomas, which is one of the biggest universities in the Philippines, which trains a lot of our people, they probably would be refused. And I know this is a huge complex issue, but funny enough, the University of Santo Tomas is actually a quarter century older than Harvard.
I just want to have that silence to just sink it through. That's also like the first, or one of the first, I believe it's the first educational institution in at least Southeast Asia. So, they're older than the Philippines itself. But coming back to policing the Filipinx community here in Jojiague, Montreal, I believe that most of us are aware that 80% of the SPVM officers don't even live in the island itself. So, thank you for the loud, yes. And then 37, so, I did the maths from Google, thank you, Google. That's 3,780 Montreal police officers who don't live in the island, who police our community. So they're policing communities they're not part of. Marginal effort, I would say zero effort to actually understand the community they police. We love karaoke, we're very loud. When we speak, we're very loud. So if you don't know these cultural differences, you would think this is public disturbances, right? Like coming from my legal background, like this is public disturbances, I can give you a fine. But that's our culture. And there's no effort or marginal effort for them to understand the communities they police. They don't live with us. So the police academy, it's an institution, so institutional racism. They're teaching them and they're perpetuating this racist ideology that is being enforced to us. Again, they don't live with us, so they don't know that we're loud. And here in Montreal, there's 44,000 Filipinos living in Montreal alone, and we all know that we mostly live in Uptown. We all have roots in Uptown. Some of us still live in Uptown. Along with other immigrant communities, so not only that we have the internal divide and conquer and us and them, but physically we're all just pushed in one space, so it's much easier for them to police. So like they thought this through, and then that's when the racial profiling comes in, that's when the intimidation comes in, and then that's when the effects of the mental health, the substance abuse, the gambling, the poverty, and then again, because they don't know us, they don't know that we also embody that culture and that colonial rule that we're still using. I want to pass this on to our healthcare professional here, mental health, to talk about the effects of the mental health for newcomers like both of us. Yeah, we're both newcomers, yeah.
Thank you. So yes, from a mental health perspective, there's definitely no sense of belonging, and this kind of deepens itself, especially because there's a real struggle with intergenerational dialogue in our community. I do think things are changing, let's say with like the 1.5 generation and the younger generation, because we do have a community now that has grown up here in Montreal and understands each other's reality. But in terms of kind of the 1.5 and the previous generation, their parents, there's a huge disconnect because the reality of growing up was completely different, right? So you have parents trying to raise children here in Canada, but their reference point is times of martial law in the Philippines or things like that. So there's a huge disconnect there that creates a lot of like family conflict. And then there's also the issue of family separation. What usually happens is you will have a mom get a job here as a temporary foreign worker and basically leave her family and send money back, and of course will be filing for paperwork to get her children here, but usually that takes between, 2 to 10 years if you're lucky. So can you imagine not having been with your child for almost 10 years and what that relationship looks like when the child comes back? This also creates a lot of danger for our Filipino youth, because if they feel like the environment at home is toxic and they have nowhere to go, then what are they doing? They are in our parks, they're roaming our streets. So another invisible struggle of the Filipino community, yes, is alcohol use, is actually crystal meth use, and people are always surprised by that. In our culture, we call it shabu, and it's a really, really big deal that's not really talked about. There's also this big, really clear pipeline from either high school to like just low wage employment, and that's if they finish high school to begin with. And usually, because we're coming from such a survivor mentality, you'll have parents actually discouraging youth from going to school because they'll be like, oh my goodness, did they offer you a full-time position at your retail job and there's insurance? By all means, take it, because we're just thinking survival mentality, right? As opposed to the longer term investment of juggling, working part-time, going to school part-time, and getting that degree that might create a little bit more security for them. In more specific cultural components that are also linked to kind of like, I've been talking a lot about colonial mentality, and I feel like I should kind of elaborate on what that looks like a little bit more for us. So a colonial mentality for us is the internalized attitude of ethnic or cultural inferiority felt by people as a result of colonization.